10 through 12. Yes, 10 through 12. Now, this is, again, the conversion of Saul's story. So, this is after he went blind. This is right after he saw the light of Jesus shining down, hearing the voice, and was told to go to Damascus. So he's on his way to Damascus as he intended, but with different purpose. He actually rose in Damascus and not having food or drink. So he's there. I don't think it points out how long he's been there 3 days. But I believe this is happening during that 3 days, honestly, because I believe Ananias came after the 3 days, but God, I think, spoke to him beforehand to where he'd be there at the end of the 3 days. Now there was in Damascus a believer named Ananias. The Lord spoke to him in a vision, calling Ananias. Yes, Lord, he replied. So we see this similar with Samuel as a child in the temple. It's an interesting point. The reason why Saul was going to Damascus was to get a group of believers and carry them out to be persecuted by Rome. So the fact that Ananias was picked out of these group of believers that was there shows that God saw something special in Ananias to do this. Ananias isn't mentioned much any other place in Scripture, if any, outside this story. I don't believe any outside this story is mentioned, except for maybe Paul retelling it. But God, his purpose in doing this was very important, because we see what Paul became when God knew what Paul would become. And Ananias, you got to understand, he knows who Saul is. He knows Saul's the one that persecutes a Christian. So you got to see how shaky he is about this whole thing of what he's asked. But sometimes God may have an individual do one thing that's significant because of who he does, who he helps. And it was very significant for Ananias to do this because of what Paul would become. So, even though Ananias ain't mentioned elsewhere, his role was as important as anybody else, because he, in a way, by doing this, would have helped disciple Paul. Because he was one of the first believers, and Paul saw his genuineness to help him. This would have meant a lot to him, and through that, Paul would have got his first set of discipleship as a Christian through Ananias. Okay, verse 11. And the Lord said, Go over to the straight street and the house of the man named Judas, and ask there for Saul of Tarsus. He is praying to me right now. So the fact that he's hearing go to Saul is probably a red flag to him. The fact that he's hearing about Saul praying is probably like, what, Saul praying to you? Saul's one of them Pharisees. So he's, of course, Ananias is the right person because he has a heart and is willing to go, but still, hearing this would have caught him off guard, and he would have been a little fearful. And regardless of whether we have fear of what he calls us to do, we're to act in obedience. And that's what Ananias does. Verse 12. I have shown him a vision of a man named Ananias coming and laying hands on him so that he can see again. So he tells him that pretty much he's letting him know Saul's blind and that he already knows he's coming. And it's just, Ananias' role is important, and whatever God calls us to do, it may seem little, it may seem big, but it's important. Because it all fits into the puzzle he's making of his work.